Elena Rousseau adjusted her headlamp one final time before descending into the forbidden sections of the Paris Catacombs, her geological survey equipment weighing heavily in the canvas bag slung across her shoulder. Beside her, urban explorer Marcus Chen checked his camera settings, his breathing echoing in the narrow limestone corridor that stretched ahead like the throat of some ancient beast. The acoustic readings from the university's preliminary survey showed anomalies in this section, Elena said, her voice carrying further than it should in the confined space. Sound waves behaving in ways that don't match the tunnel's physical dimensions. The limestone should absorb most frequencies, but we're getting reflection patterns that suggest something else entirely. Marcus had been exploring Paris's underground networks for over a decade, but this particular section beneath the Montparnasse district had always unsettled him. Unlike the tourist-accessible areas with their carefully arranged bones and official pathways, these deeper tunnels retained the raw, unsettling presence of their origins as medieval quarries. The walls here bore no decorative arrangements of femurs and skulls, just rough-hewn limestone carved by workers who had died centuries before either of them was born. The locals call it the Whispering Chamber, Marcus said, leading them deeper into the darkness. Not the French locals, they won't talk about this place at all. But the cataphiles, the people who've spent years down here, they all know about it. They say if you speak into certain sections of wall, the tunnel whispers back. Elena's scientific training rejected supernatural explanations, but she had learned to trust empirical evidence above theoretical expectations. The university's acoustic analysis had detected sound patterns in this area that defied conventional physics. Echoes that lasted longer than they should, frequencies that seemed to amplify rather than diminish with distance. And most puzzling of all, audio recordings that contained sounds not present during the original recording sessions. There, Marcus stopped at a section of wall where the limestone showed unusual formations, almost like frozen waves in the rock face. The acoustics change right here. People say this is where the whispers are strongest. Elena unpacked her sensitive recording equipment, digital meters that could detect sound patterns far below the threshold of human hearing. As she calibrated the devices, the silence around them seemed to grow denser, more expectant. The weight of millions of tons of rock above their heads was nothing compared to the pressure she felt from the darkness that stretched beyond their lights. "Say something," she instructed Marcus, positioning a microphone against the unusual rock formation. "Speak directly to the wall, like the local reports described." Marcus felt slightly foolish, but he leaned close to the limestone and spoke clearly. "Can you hear me?" The words hung in the air for a moment, but seemed to be absorbed by the stone itself. Elena's equipment registered the sound waves, tracking their path and measuring their decay. But instead of the expected acoustic signature, the displays showed something impossible. The sound waves were reflecting back with additional frequencies, as if the tunnel was adding its own voice to Marcus's words. "Did you hear that?" Elena whispered, staring at her readings. "Hear what?" Marcus said, as even as he spoke, he could feel something changing in the air around them. The quality of silence had shifted, as if the tunnel itself was now listening. Elena's equipment detected it first, a low-frequency hum just below the range of normal hearing, like the distant sound of machinery or breathing. But there was no machinery in these abandoned sections of the catacombs, no ventilation systems or electrical equipment that could produce such a sound. The frequency signature matched what her university colleagues had recorded weeks earlier, but experiencing it in person was entirely different. "The limestone in this area has unusual mineral deposits," Elena said, more to herself than to Marcus. "Quartz inclusions that could theoretically create piezoelectric effects under pressure. But that wouldn't explain the acoustic patterns we're seeing." As if responding to her analysis, the humming sound grew more distinct, resolving into something that almost resembled human speech. Not words exactly, but the rhythm and cadence of conversation just beyond the edge of comprehension. Marcus felt the hair on his arms stand up as he realized the sound was coming from the same section of wall where he had spoken. "Elena, your equipment, is it recording this?" She checked her displays, watching as the digital readouts showed acoustic patterns that shouldn't exist in a simple limestone tunnel. The sound waves were creating complex interference patterns, as if multiple conversations were occurring simultaneously in the same space. But the most disturbing reading was the temporal displacement. The equipment detected sounds that preceded the actual acoustic events, as if the tunnel was responding to their presence before they made any noise. "There's something in the rock structure itself," Elena said, running her hands along the unusual formations. "These aren't natural limestone formations. Look at the tool marks. These were carved deliberately, but not like the rest of the quarry work. These patterns follow acoustic principles like someone was designing a sound chamber." Marcus examined the wall more closely with his powerful LED lights. Elena was right. The carved patterns weren't random quarry marks. They formed a complex geometric design that seemed to spiral deeper into the rock face, creating channels and chambers that would focus and amplify sound waves. But the carving style was unlike anything he had seen in decades of exploring Parisian underground spaces. The historical records, Marcus said slowly, mentioned strange construction in this area during the 14th century. Workers reported that their tools would echo strangely, that they could hear conversations from other parts of the quarry that should have been too far away to detect. Some of them claimed the rocks themselves were talking back. Elena's scientific instruments continued to record impossible data. The acoustic signatures suggested that sound was not just reflecting off the tunnel walls, but somehow being processed and modified by the rock structure itself. The frequency analysis showed harmonic patterns consistent with human speech, but at wavelengths that preceded any sounds they had made. "Speak to it again," Elena said, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "But this time, ask it something specific." Marcus approached the carved section of wall, feeling increasingly as if he was participating in some ancient ritual rather than a scientific investigation. "What happened to the workers who carved these patterns?" The response came immediately, not as words, but as a complex acoustic pattern that Elena's equipment registered as multiple overlapping voices. The sound seemed to emerge from deep within the limestone itself, carrying undertones that spoke of centuries-old suffering and entrapment. Elena watched her displays in fascination and growing horror. The acoustic analysis showed that the sounds contained information far more complex than simple echoes. The frequency patterns included variations in tone and rhythm that suggested emotional fear, confusion, in a desperate attempt to communicate across an impossible barrier. The workers, Elena said, understanding flooding through her as she interpreted the data. They didn't just carve these patterns randomly. They were trying to create a communication system. But something went wrong. The historical records Marcus had studied mentioned a section of the medieval quarries where workers had become trapped during a collapse in 1348. The official records stated that the bodies were never recovered, that the tunnel had been sealed and abandoned. But the acoustic evidence suggested something far more disturbing, that the workers had continued trying to communicate long after they should have perished. The mineral deposits in the limestone, Elena continued, her scientific training struggling to process what her instruments were telling her. Under extreme pressure and specific acoustic conditions, quartz can theoretically store and replay electromagnetic patterns, like a natural recording medium, but one that responds to sound waves rather than electrical signals. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "You're saying the rock itself recorded their voices? And it's still playing them back?" "Not just their voices," Elena said, studying the complex waveform patterns on her screen. "Their terror, their confusion, their final attempts to call for help. The limestone has been storing and replaying the acoustic patterns of their last days for over 600 years. As if summoned by her words, the whispers grew stronger, more distinct. Both Elena and Marcus could now hear them clearly, not one voice, but many, overlapping and echoing through the carved channels. The voices spoke in medieval French, words of prayer and desperation and confusion that had been trapped in the stone since the 14th century. Elena's equipment detected something else, a new pattern in the acoustic signatures, one that matched their own voices and heartbeats. The tunnel was learning from them, adding their sounds to the ancient collection of human noise trapped in its mineral structure. "We need to leave," Marcus said, but his voice emerged as part of the chorus now, joining the centuries-old conversation that played endlessly through the carved limestone. "It's adding us to the collection." Elena gathered her equipment with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the realization that they had discovered something that science could explain but not accept. The tunnel that whispered back was not supernatural. It was something far more disturbing. It was a natural phenomenon that had trapped human voices in stone, creating an eternal recording of suffering that played back whenever new sounds triggered its release. As they retreated through the dark corridors toward the surface, Elena's equipment continued to register impossible readings. Behind them, the carved section of limestone continued its ancient function, storing their voices and adding them to the collection of sounds that would whisper back to the next visitors foolish enough to seek conversation with the dead. The tunnel had whispered back to them, just as the reports had promised. But what it had whispered was the accumulated desperation of workers who had died centuries ago, their final words preserved in mineral form and played back through acoustic principles that turned limestone into a natural recording device. Elena's scientific equipment had documented the phenomenon completely, providing empirical proof of something that challenged the boundaries between physics and horror. Above ground, in the safety of Paris streets, Elena would spend months analyzing the data, publishing papers that would revolutionize understanding of acoustic geology while carefully omitting the emotional weight of what they had discovered. But she would never forget the voices in the stone, or the realization that some forms of human suffering could become literally etched in the landscape, waiting for the right acoustic conditions to be heard again by the living.